I don't want no oil a-spoiling my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things a-creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes!
Good morning, Toledo. And good afternoon, Columbus. And hello to those of you listening on the internet, wherever and whenever you are. My name is Joe DeMare, and I'm here with my incredible co-host,
Rebecca Wood.
Yes, and together Rebecca and I are going to bring you a poignant hour of radio called For a Green Future. For a Green Future is a show where we talk about ecology and the environment. And we talk about it in the ways that it affects you, your wealth, your health, your happiness, the wealth and health and happiness of your friends and your families and your co-workers and the people across the street, the people across the ocean, and basically all people everywhere, because all of us are wrapped up together on this wonderful planet we call Earth. And we've got kind of a somber episode for you folks today. We're going to be talking a little bit about death in the first little bit here, because I've lost some very close friends of mine in the last week or so. I just wanted to mention them. And then we're going to we have an interview with a fella named Ralph Bloemers, who just finished a movie called Elemental. And this interview goes on a little longer than usual because he just had so much information. The movie is about the current plans to, what happens when you, quote unquote, treat forest. That is, you try to prevent forest fires by cutting them down, which seems to be the plan. It was the plan both of Trump and of the current administration. And he's just looking at the whole issue of wildfires and forest fires and what we can actually do to prevent damage, as opposed to this whole idea that you got to cut the forest down before it burns. This actually went on a little longer than usual, and so it's going to take up a bit more of the show than usual, but I tried to edit it. I cut about a third of it out, but he just has so much good information, I couldn't bring myself to trim it down to 15. Then we'll hear from our wonderful advertisers and patrons, as always. And then, Rebecca, what have you got for us?
I have got a segment which I call, How Many Millers Does It Take to Find a Bog?
Okay, a pressing question. Then we've got Ecological News, and as I said, we'd like to hear from you at any time at 877-909-1007. So just back to the subject of death, unfortunately. A friend of mine, her name was Esther Clinton, passed away recently, and after a long battle with an unknown illness. They never did actually quite figure out what caused her problems or why she was dying. Also, just this past Friday, I lost my brother-in-law, a fellow named Rick Rohan, and we do know why he died. He died of mesothelioma, and he most likely got it while he was working in a gypsum mine where he worked for 37 years. And it just reminded me that, you know, we had to battle for years, had to battle the asbestos industry to get to admit asbestos was bad for you and shut it down and, you know, stop killing people with it. I don't know why environmentalists have such a enormous burden of proof on these things that we know harm people. And, you know, Rick's life was cut much shorter than it should have been. Otherwise he was like a really tough, hardy guy, but when you get a cancer like that, toughness only takes you so far. And, you know, it brings up the point that Americans should be living longer than they are. I mean, we're in the point in history where the baby boomers are starting to die off, and, you know, there's going to be a huge wave of people passing away, just like there was a huge wave of people being born and people getting into college. You know, all those, the wave of the baby boomers is now passing, but we're dying younger than we should be, because since 2014, the US is the only industrialized country in the world where life expectancy has actually been dropping since 2014. And in all the other industrialized worlds with rational medical systems, medical payment systems, life expectancy has continued to go up. Now, except for COVID in 2019, in that year, life expectancy went down all over the globe, but it went down 3 times as much in the United States. And in the next year, 2020, in the rest of the world, life expectancy rebounded, added 0.3 years. But in the US, it continued to decline. We instead of adding 0.3 years in 2021, like the rest of the industrialized world, we lost another 0.4 years. And, you know, it just reminds me about all these things that we environmentalists talk about, the fact that if you add radiation to the environment, if you add chemicals to the environment, if you add plastics to the environment, it's going to affect people's health, and people are going to die younger and more miserably than they would if they got to live, you know, their full life expectancy, like they're doing in every other industrialized nation.
Also bad if, like, large portions of the earth are on fire or underwater.
Yes.
For life expectancy, I was going to say.
That's true. I mean, global warming is going to reduce life expectancy more. But all these other countries where rational thought prevails, where once they discover something is bad for you, they regulate it. Once they discover that something is harmful, like radiation, Germany made the decision to phase out all their nuclear plants because they did a study that showed cancer rates double within 5 miles of a nuke plant. And so they said, let's get rid of our nukes.
I feel like we should quickly point out that for the people who are actually going to be watching the video which Joe is making, I'm not actually drinking creamer straight from the bottle. It's tea. It's green tea.
Right, yeah. Speaking of healthy life choices.
I'm fairly nuts, but not on that level.
Right, yeah. But that a lot of people, like, purposefully ignore the stuff that we learn, the stuff that scientists come up with, like the idea that just drinking creamer straight, you know, is not a healthy breakfast drink.
Yeah, people are going to watch it and be, I think I figured out why your life expectancy is going down, Becca.
But in the US, we have this sort of macho idea that, we're going to just ignore science. We're just going to ignore what the doctors are learning. We're just going to ignore what the scientists have discovered. And that ties us directly into our guest, Ralph Bloemers, because what forest scientists and fire ecologists and fire scientists are discovering is that the worst possible thing we can do is what the Biden administration is proposing to do. And his movie, that is not the main point of his movie, but that message does come through pretty clearly. So let's give a listen, and Josh, let's go ahead and run that interview with Ralph Bloemers. All right, well, Ralph, thanks so much for doing this interview. I really appreciate it. And so could you just give us the title of your film and what it's a quick recap about what it's about?
Yes, over the last 5 years, I've worked on a film entitled Elemental, and the film is about fire in the West. It's an investigative documentary that invites the viewer to sort of reimagine their relationship with fire. And we visit with scientists, indigenous fire practitioners, and landscapes across the West to get a better understanding of how we can live and coexist with fire on the landscape.
Yeah. And I understand you made this film with someone named Trip Jennings, and you guys took a little flight in a Cessna way back before you started this project. Could you tell us about that flight you took?
Yeah, I think, you know, viewers and people in general, they really appreciate being respected. And one of the things that we've tried to do is present folks with A and B and then let them equal C. And with respect to wildfire, a lot of times what you get is kind of where's the body reporting by the main news media, you know, that fires destroy forests, that everything's burned up. And so one of the things you hear is this was a 50,000 acre fire and everything was destroyed or incinerated within inside that fire perimeter. And with respect to the Eagle Creek fire that burned in the Columbia River Gorge, it was a 50,000 acre fire perimeter, and this is a beloved area. It does have a couple small communities in it, but it's a beloved area outside of Portland and Vancouver, Washington, between Hood River and Portland. And it's visited by millions of people every summer. And so we took to the air to just document the mosaic burn pattern. So of a 50,000 acre fire perimeter, you will have patches completely unburned, usually around half. You will have patches of that forest that are severely burned. That doesn't mean they're destroyed. It just means they're severely burned. And the trees are killed. And that was about 8,000 acres. And what this then looks like is a mosaic. And so the best way to demonstrate that is through pictures and from the air. And that kind of led us to also take to the ground, deploy wildlife cameras, time-lapse cameras, where we captured the rebirth in the burn, life in the burn, because some of the other beliefs are that, you know, that a forest is destroyed and all the wildlife is killed. Well, most of them know how to survive fire. They've evolved with it over hundreds, thousands of years. And that was the idea with taking to the sky. And what we did was we took a scientist up with us who then from the air narrated what he saw. And then at the same time, in that same short little film we made, we had gone and visited an area that had burned 8 years prior with another scientist, and she explained what she saw there to sort of help people decatastrophize wildfire and help people sort of see the natural process and take a longer view of forests and fire in our forests.
Okay. And so from there, you saw the need to make a larger film. And in fact, that project took you 5 years to make. Did you think it would take so long, or was this a case of the rabbit hole getting deeper and deeper as you went down it?
Yeah, to do effective outdoor time lapse in post-fire landscapes probably at least takes 2 to 3 years in the Western Cascades. I mean, you will see a rapid green up within 2 to 3 years. So you pretty much capture that within 2 to 3 years. And we started in 2017, and people saw what we had done with Cascade Locks Elementary School kids, which is a small town. We took the kids out into the forest, and 2 years after the fire, and that one of them remarked, "It's over, it's over." I mean, mind you, the fire was out pretty much about 2 years prior to that little girl saying that. But just the experience of being in the woods for her, which was not a regular thing, and seeing how the fire had burned and seeing all the life in there was mind-opening for her, mind-blowing. And we just, with the work that we had been doing with short film and sharing that with the news media and getting that out there, we were encouraged to keep going, Joseph. So we started making more and more, and we raised some money. Trip did from National Geographic and Patagonia, and then I was recruited by Trip to serve as the executive producer. you know, titles in a small film only are so relevant, but it meant that I assisted with the fundraising to make the film. It meant that I carried gear into the forest. It meant, you know, that I helped set up interviews with a lot of the scientists throughout the West because I knew them through my work, and helped sort of identify who those people might be. And Tripp, with his credentials of producing for National Geographic and PBS, was able to open some doors as well. So I set out to capture wildlife and I specifically went to the most intensely burned patches of forest to show what life was like there. And what I found was a cacophony of noise and life, and lots of large mammals and small mammals and birds. And we identified a number of folks that were really knowledgeable about these things and filmed with them. And I currently have probably over 60 cameras deployed throughout Oregon and Washington. And we thought we finished the film in 2020. You know, it's like writing a book. You finally are like, okay, I got to put the book, this book is done. You could keep polishing it. And then we had the 2020 wildfires in Oregon, which burned across 1 million acres total perimeter in multiple fires that were ignited when a huge windstorm hit the state, moving from the east to the west. So it came from Canada across Montana, Idaho, into eastern Washington, and then down into Oregon. And it knocked power lines down that were energized, or it knocked trees into those power lines that were energized. And then there were some existing fires that were fanned as well. And the estimates are that anywhere between 650,000 acres of the fire's perimeter, the fire perimeters in Oregon of 1 million acres were either sole source caused by power line ignitions or significant contribution from. And those start in valley bottoms, and they typically, because that's where the smaller distribution lines are, they can start elsewhere. And they're typically about 10 times the size of normal fires because they're started in wind events. And it was droughty, and it was around Labor Day. And in Southern Oregon, there was a fire that burned 2,000 houses, roughly a little bit more than that, in the Santiam Canyon outside of our capital. Half the town of a small town of Gates burned, over 140 some homes. And across the state, it was over 4,000. So that was, you know, a really big deal. And I had a number of friends that lost everything, literally no warning. T-shirts, ran out of their homes with their pet or pets and fled. And in the wake of that, I was invited in by some of them and other people who had seen some of the wildlife photography and other work that we had done to see if their homes survived. And I found power lines down. I found burn scars in roads. I found the fire camp in the town of Gates, which was the base for the elite firefighter camp, burned to the ground because the power line had come down on a metal cyclone fence. It ignited the fire camp, and they had to flee. And I just felt like this was so significant, at least for Oregon, that we had the events that were similar to what people have heard about and seen in California and witnessed and experienced and lived through, that we had to include it. So we did that. We included 2020, and that took most of 2021. And at the end of 2021, we had some big fires in California. We had Caldor, Dixie, and Bootleg, with one of them burning clear across the Sierra Nevada mountains and back down the other side. And some of these fires forming their own, what are called pyrocumulus clouds, which go up to about 20,000 feet plus. And then during the day, and when it cools at night, they collapse on themselves. So these are intense fire events. And so we ended the film pretty much at the end of 2021, Joseph. It just was, we were compelled to include 2020, and then it bled into 2021.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you mentioned the cameras. I have to say, the cinematography in this film is just incredible. I mean, some of the pictures of fire that you guys captured were just so like beautiful and terrifying and really compelling. Can you talk a little bit about the camera work?
Tripp is very skilled, and he has the equipment to shoot beautiful cinema quality time lapses and interviews. And he bought himself the Nomex gear, which is, all non-synthetic firefighting gear where you can be next to very hot fires and not feel it. And it's what all the firefighters wear. He had goggles, and he and Sarah went, into fires. He would go up onto mountaintops to capture some of those time lapses, just using his determination and grit to get to some of these places, and camp out all night and look very carefully which way the winds were blowing to be able to capture some of those things. And he was on the active fire line in California for a lot of it. And then, the scenes with the home, the duplex that was built for us to film, those are really neat. I think a lot of people respond to that. Yeah, he's fantastic. I mean, I think it's just a lot of determination to get the shot and a willingness to take risks to get the shot that allow that. And of course, the skill in doing that. When you shoot a lot of the highest end video in 4,000 resolution, you're actually shooting it all pretty flat color wise, like a raw image in photography. And then afterwards, you populate and color sweeten it all. That's very normal. So you basically capture all the data with your camera, instead of it coming through like a retail camera would. So I've learned a lot in working with him. And I've also myself done a lot of shooting. So a lot of the wildlife footage that's in the film, I took, and I carried in 50, 60, 70, sometimes 80 pounds, 2 packs, one in the front, one in the back, 7, 8 miles in, set them up, fell down a bunch because it's very unstable terrain, climbed out, and then came back, 2 months later and went, dope, I didn't do this right. And then I would set it up again and bring batteries in and bring solar panels in, or bears would push my equipment down to the ground. It's really hard actually to do time lapse really well outside because you have so many light changes. Mm-hmm. And so you have to really find the right spots where you don't have the sky in the background, or you have to balance all of that out. It's gets me out in the woods a lot, which is wonderful. But probably, Joseph, for every hour out in the woods, it's a couple hours to 3 hours fiddling with your camera gear before you get there.
Okay. Now, one of the most poignant parts of the film for me was when you were interviewing the forest ecologist, the fire ecologist, who in the film, she takes you on a tour of a burned area and basically shows people how alive it still is and how much carbon it's still capturing, or it captured even though it burned. And then it turns out that her, quote unquote, her patch of forest that she studied for decades had been burned and then had been logged. And it just, you could just tell how awful that felt for her. And was that hard to shoot, or?
Dr. Beverly Law is among the top forest scientists in the world with respect to carbon cycles. And yes, it was hard to see a site that we had been to multiple times that was part of this global research network that was contributing to understanding be cut after it was burned. It wasn't hard to see it be burned because it was still a pretty nice mosaic and all the carbon was pretty much there, right? So about 2 to 3% of live tree carbon goes up when a fire burns a patch of forest. People think it's a lot more, but it's really a small amount, mostly in a big smoke plume. It's water vapor. And there's a number of carbon truths that are very poorly understood by the general public. And, scientists like Dr. Law, dedicate their lives and their careers to studying this and following the data to wherever it leads them. And the narratives that are out there, which is that, it's all burned up and huge amounts of carbon pollution, and the narratives, for example, that young trees store carbon at a faster rate, or that wood products store carbon for a long time, are a portion of the picture, and they don't present the whole picture. And so it's wonderful when experts like Dr. Law look at the total picture and the total mass balance of carbon over time. We could have dedicated an entire film to further unpacking the carbon truths. But I think it is a very poignant moment in the film, and you're not the only one that has reacted to that. Many people have reacted to that in other moments in the film. People that I've been surprised have reacted to Dr. Law, very rural, conservative folks just saying, we need to follow the science. We need to follow it wherever it leads us. And, it's interesting with respect to, let's say, the notion that man can be in control of wildfire, either through suppression, right, putting all fires out, and where that's led us, and the fact that we've been successful or were successful at it from the 40s to the 80s. We touch on that in the film, and how climate, in other words, cool, wet period from the 40s to the 80s gave fire suppression a helping hand. But the notion that we can cut forests or cut vegetation and maintain that over space and time in such a way to affect fire behavior is very parallel, right? It is man dominating over nature, over space and time, okay? And if there's limits to our ability to fight fire, which clearly there are, then there should be limits to our ability to guess where fire will burn, thin that patch before it burns, and then hope that thinning affects the behavior of fire when it burns there. It's a lot of luck involved in that exercise, particularly when you're talking about a vast ocean of vegetation. And as Dr. Tanya Schoenagel says in the film, attempting to cut vegetation and affect fire behavior is a very small lever. And she says, it's like trying to take a cup and making the ocean less wet. So quickly going back to Dr. Law and other experts in her field, they have found cutting vegetation before fire comes releases more carbon than fire itself, 5 to 10 times more carbon than fire itself. So that's a big deal, okay? Young trees do store carbon at a faster rate, but they're tiny. And so even if it's like saying, hey, Joseph, would you rather have a bank account with $100 making 7%, or one with $1 million making 5%, right? So that's another carbon truth that Dr. Law has helped unpack. In terms of wood products, they do store carbon if they're in a house, and the house lasts a long time, but pallets, decks, newsprint, toilet paper, magazines. No, they don't store it for very long. And also from the tree to the end product, there's a lot of loss. And she just accounts for everything in the total mass balance and follows the data to wherever it leads her. And, you know, the notion is, well, the fire destroyed the forest. We need to clean it up. We need to cut it and replant it, and it will come back quicker. Well, you can see on that forest type, it's actually a dry forest type. It's on the eastern side of the Cascades in Oregon, which many people don't know is high desert and transition to desert and very droughty. You know, that place that's been scraped, cut and scraped may not come back as a forest for a long time, if ever, because of that. You're talking 20 degrees Fahrenheit hotter in a as compared to a burned forest as a burned and cut forest. And there's no shade left. You know, there's just so many effects. And what Dr. Law is seeing there is and reacting to is a place that she spent a lifetime studying and spent a lot of time there. And I think that it's a manifestation. Her reaction is a manifestation of her struggle, both through her work, but also she's testified numerous times to Congress, been invited many times to testify. So I think you're seeing her reaction to all of that in that moment.
Yeah, you captured her reaction brilliantly in the film. I believe you've sort of answered my next question already. The Biden administration right now is proposing to quote unquote treat 50 million acres, area larger than South Dakota, in other words, basically to clear cut them in order to prevent forest fires. Does this sound like a good strategy to you?
Well, I think Elemental addresses what is the top experts thinking with respect to how do we keep homes and communities from burning. And what we learned in visiting with them is that what happens more than 60 feet from the home with respect to vegetation doesn't make a lick of difference in terms of whether the home will ignite. And in particular, 5 feet from the home is just about really where you need to focus. So don't have bark mulch and other fine material right under your siding within 5 feet of your house, because that'll ignite and then ignite your siding. Don't have fine material in your gutters, because that'll ignite that fine material and ignite the eaves on your house. Make sure your venting is covered, or that it's fine mesh venting and keeps the embers out of the house. I think if your goal is to prevent homes and community loss, then cutting vegetation is not the way to get there. Now, the challenge with wildfire and forest management in general is there's many different forest types, Joseph. There's dry forest types. There's moist mixed conifer, higher elevation among the dry forest types. There's wet forest types where I am living currently and where I spend a lot of time. West of the Cascades, it's what people think of when they think of Oregon and Washington, the Pacific Northwest, moss covered, old growth forests, etc. So in Oregon, let's just look at the statistics. We have about 50 million acres of land, 50 million acres of land. We have 30 million acres of forests. 10 million of those 30 million acres of forest land are largely owned by industrial tree farming corporations. And about 6.8 million of that is grown on a short rotation, 35 years, cut, plant, spray chemicals to kill the competing vegetation, grow at 35 years, cut. They're growing money, okay? And they're cutting down money. And those aren't forests, those are tree farms. And those are all spaced very close together. They're not going to change how they're doing it for fire behavior. And as outlined in the film by Dr. Chris Dunn, those burn real hot. So the point is, forest management can affect fire behavior positively and negatively. Okay, but the larger point, and what we're seeing being made by the experts in the film, is that drought and wind, not vegetation, not burnable material, are the primary drivers of forest fires these days, or wildland fires, which are also occurring in grasslands and shrublands. And if we look at home loss statistics, Dr. Seifert told us after watching the movie, and mind you, we did not let any of the experts watch the movie while it was in production. It was only until it was done. And they're all very happy with the result and very complimentary. But Dr. Seifert said, well, you all focused a lot on forest. Did you know that 2/3 of all home loss occurs in grasslands and shrublands? So if we're going to spend all this money, quote, treating forests, and even if it's that many acres that get done, you're still going to have home loss in grasslands and shrublands if you don't deal with the home ignition zone and the ignitability of homes. And I think most people, when they're concerned about wildfire, are concerned about losing their home. And they're concerned, of course, about smoke. And they're concerned about the places around them that they love and enjoy, that give them their sense of place, that root them in that place, and how it's faring in fire. So the film really tries to focus on that lived experience and where people are. But if we come back to your question of, is it possible for people with tools, chainsaws, other cutting tools, feller bunchers, whatever they might be, big or small, to control vegetation over vast landscapes, over space and time, to affect fire behavior? And I don't believe that it's been proven out. I think that it's, as Dr. Tanya Schoenagel says in the film, that the odds that a thinned patch will burn before it grows back is less than 1%. That's a needle in a haystack. A lot of people don't, probabilities are like 1%. What does that mean? I mean, it's a shot in the dark, right? And here's the thing. If it burns before it's grown back, then will it affect fire behavior? Well, it depends on how much drought and wind there is. It depends on other factors. And so it may make sense around communities to create operable space for firefighters. But in Oregon, if you take every census designated place and you draw a 1/4 mile circle around all of them, or blob around them, perimeter, you're looking at 100 to 150,000 acres. You're not looking at millions of acres, okay? And if you are really going to treat those acres, in other words, take the fine material out, not the valuable larger timbers that don't burn up and are fire resistant, and you are burning afterwards, you're spending a lot of money per acre, at least $2,000 per acre. So do the math, and it's not durable over space and time. I think there's a fair amount of wishful thinking, and there's a fair amount of selective examples that make these things look viable, but it's never really been rigorously examined from sort of a business plan perspective, whether it can be scaled up over space and time. And also, for every dollar or thousands of dollars that's spent on that, that's $1 or thousands of dollars that are not spent preparing homes and communities from igniting. I mean, so I think there's trade-offs. I guess what I'd say is one thing to make clear to listeners is that fire is paradoxical. It's not simple answers. I think some of these so-called treatments, they're not necessarily clear cutting. They could be thinning, but they could be taking fairly big material to make it pay, because that's what's valuable to take. They are building roads, which then can be used by someone in the future to go camping or go down that road and light a firework. they're compacting the soil. They're if they're clearing out all the vegetation, well, that could be habitat for some creature. So, but again, zooming out, the larger picture is what we're seeing is that these big fires, Joseph, are being driven by drought and wind, and they're overtaking our efforts to manipulate vegetation. And in some cases, if you thin a forest, the fire will burn through it quicker because there's increased wind speed. It really depends.
Right.
So I hope that helps unpack some of that. I don't really like to say absolutes, black or white, in really most anything. But I do think that there's serious questions about the efficacy and scalability over this, because in 20 years, you're going to have to rinse and repeat and come up with billions more dollars. You're going to release more carbon than fire itself. That's going to be contributing probably to more warming. So you're kind of in this vicious cycle. And really, most of the loss from fires occurs from 1% of fires. It's the 1% of extreme fire events that we need to be prepared to deal with.
All right. Well, but fortunately, we only got about a minute left. So anything you want to add?
Well, the film has been selected for 7 film festivals so far. We're very excited that we got into Mill Valley Film Festival in Northern California, which is a premier film festival, and the Valley Film Festival in Southern California. We have a website, elementalfilm.com, where you can inquire about bringing the film to a theater near you. Folks across the West, from firefighters to local communities that are with fire survivors, are really excited about the film, and we have screening set up for or will be set up soon for most states in the West. And then eventually it'll go to streaming. So, I mean, I encourage you just to watch the film yourself and hear what the experts have to say. And to the extent that you ever have an opportunity to go walk around in a burned forest, do that, see it for yourself, hear the noise in there and the life in there yourself. And really know that there's something in there for you. I like to think of a burned forest as a young person. It's full of potential, full of life, and nature is about to paint it green. And so, it is part of the cycle. And the paradox for us is, we like the forests as we know them, and then when they prove themselves to be wild and dynamic, we mourn those changes. But they're quite resilient, and unlike a home, they rebirth and regrow on their own. So I have taken many people into the burn forest, and myself went through that same journey of discovery that there is something there for me, that it is not that not all is lost when a forest burns.
All right, so that was our rather long interview with Ralph Bloemers, but I think you might agree, I hope you agree, that what he had to say was important enough that I'm glad I played the whole thing. Now, speaking of important things to say, I want to talk about our patrons and sponsors. For Green Futures brought to you by the Wood County Park District. The Wood County Park District is a natural resources conservation agency. They protect natural spaces, maintain quality green spaces, provide engaging programming, and they teach people to love and respect nature. They restore wildlife habitats, often using fire, actually, and they lead outdoor adventures. Wood County Parks protects natural spaces in Wood County for all to enjoy, from 8 a.m. to 30 minutes past sunset every day of the year. And there's several ways to get a hold of them. One, you can give them a call, and that is at 419-353-1897. You can also go to their website, wcparks.org. They have a great app, which you go to any app store and download. Just search for WC Parks. And, of course, they're on all the social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, etc., etc., etc. That's the Wood County Park District. And For Green Futures also brought to you by our patrons. And patrons are just wonderful people who've gone to patreon.com. That's Patreon. They searched for a Green Future. Up popped our terrific Patreon page. and they signed up for a monthly donation at a rate that they can afford. And every month a little bit comes out of their account, comes over to us, and that's how we can afford to keep bringing you this amazing show, which you will not hear this kind of information anywhere else, unfortunately. So that's it for now, and now it's time to go over to Rebecca.
Yes. So yeah, my uncle took on the bog yet again. This time he brought his son and grandson for reinforcements. On a related note, my cousin is definitely getting into heaven, although he's an atheist. And they can't keep him out now. They just can't. Apparently it was over 90 degrees at the trailhead, and they had to, quote, claw their way through tangled undergrowth. I get the impression there was a near mutiny during that. My understanding of wetlands is as follows, my uncle talking. A marsh has a solid bottom and lots of water and water-living plants like cattails and arrowroot. A swamp supports woody plants, including substantial trees. A bog is a nutrient-poor environment with acidic tone, often includes a mat of floating vegetative matter. You begin in Poutwater Pond, you begin on solid ground in the forest, pass through a swampy tangle of trees and shrubs, and eventually reach the open vistas of the floating bogs like walking on a waterbed. It kind of undulates when you walk on it, and if you stand still, the water oozes up around your feet and ankles. We have that in Manhattan, our bars too. We have ground like that. Carnivorous plants inhabit the bogs: sundews, hornbladders, pitcher plants, rare flowering plants like Calogopon. I've never heard of this. Calopogon. White French orchids and golden club. The swamp is choked with blueberry bushes, and the bog has them here and there. Cranberries creep across the surface of the mat. And let's see. Lots of carnivorous plants apparently. The sundews have leaves covered in hair that have drops of sticky liquid on their tips, so when an insect gets caught in the liquid, the hairs slowly curve around it and press it into the surface of the leaf where it can be digested. Yum. Bladderworts have hollow bladders and in the water, and the bladders are aimed at little hair triggers. When an insect brushes against the trigger, bladder opens up and sucks the insect inside. The pitcher plants have long tubular leaves with liquid at the bottom and downward pointing hairs on the inside surfaces. Liquid is to drown the insects and digest them, while the hairs are designed to prevent them from crawling back out the other way to escape. And he says I'm not recommending this, mind you, just because a relative of mine has done it does not make it a good idea. Trust me on this. But he picked a pitcher plant leaf and just tasted it to put his tongue on it to see what it would taste like. Didn't have a taste to speak of, but then his lips and tongue turned numb for 20 minutes. So apparently pitcher plants have liquid at the bottom of the leaves that will also paralyze insects. So they drop into it, they can't escape. And white fringed orchids they had, he's repeating himself here. He didn't get very many blueberries. He had to really do a lot of picking to just get a little container.
Right, so he didn't have a net gain in calories, probably sounds like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a wonderful advice to not just eat random things when you're out in nature.
That might not be a good idea, but he survived.
Well, that's good. I'm glad. Yeah. So what would the score then be for your uncle versus the swamp?
I think it's 1-1. I think it's a tie.
Tie at this point. Okay. All right. So well, thanks
Welcome.
For that report from the swamp and bog.
Yes.
And
I threw in the term marsh there at some point too.
and marsh.
Yeah.
So I have seen like when I was up in the Adirondacks. One of the reasons that all those insectivorous plants are there is because there's very little nitrogen. Like if you're living on a log or some other bit of vegetation that's floating on a lake, there's very little nitrogen there, and so if you dissolve a bunch of insects, they're full of nitrogen. So yum. All right. Well, thank you, Rebecca, for that report. And moving right along, we are to the point where we're talking about ecological news. And our first story comes to us from Cuyahoga County. And this is a progression of a story that we first reported about 2 years ago. And that is that the spotted lanternfly has been found in Cuyahoga County. And the spotted lanternfly is just the latest of the Asian invasion of our ecosystems. And when we reported on it first 2 years ago, they hadn't yet entered Ohio. They were confined to like one county in Pennsylvania. But typical of the response of the government these days. They just sort of watched them and counted them, and now they're in Ohio, they're in New York, they're in a bunch of other states bordering Pennsylvania, and they're proceeding on their march to wipe out forests. And this just reminded me of the beetle, the emerald ash borer that destroyed all our ash trees, which started out in one county in Michigan. And, you know, if you have any kind of inkling of ecological systems, you know, you should do what Governor Brown did, Jerry Brown did decades ago when they found a medfly in California. And, you know, this is, I've said before, this is the one time I approve of the use of pesticides. If you find one of these terribly invasive species, terribly destructive species, you bomb the heck out of them as soon as you find them. And this idea that, oh, we're just going to watch and count, it guarantees the loss. You know, if it seems
like there's a lot of advice like, oh, you call your county an extension office and show them a picture if you see this. They want to know.
Right.
And that's kind of where the advice ends.
and don't carry firewood out of the county because that'll spread the bugs. Yes, but if you're not getting rid of the bugs, they're going to spread on their own anyway. They have these little things called wings that let them fly from place to place.
They didn't get all the way from Japan by not having any way to move themselves around.
Right, yeah, they're unable to fly across the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah, they didn't do that. It's true. They're not strong flyers.
Yeah, so it's our fault, and it just makes me angry. So if they're in Cuyahoga County this year, we can expect them here in Toledo probably next year or the year after. So be on the lookout for spotted lanternflies, and if you see them, call the state agriculture department, and they'll say, "Oh, thank you for telling us," and then do nothing else. Okay, on to another update from a story last week we talked about, and we talked about it before a lot of the mainstream press was talking about it, and that is the heat wave in Europe. And this past week, a lot of the mainstream media has reported on it, which so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it, except for two things that I wanted to say about this that always bug me whenever they talk about heat waves. And that is, whenever you see a story in the mainstream press about heat waves, it's accompanied by a picture of people at the beach, or people at a swimming pool, or people cooling themselves off in a fountain. That's not the image that we should be associating with heat waves. I think that the proper image should be like an old person in a stuffy living room with the shades drawn and a wet towel on their head, because, you know, that's the real impact of these heat waves. They really are hurting people. And the other part of the heat wave story that I wanted to point out was that thousands of people in Europe are dying. This is not coming through in the mainstream press reporting. But the last report I saw, the last number I saw given was 1,700, and that was several days ago. So I'm sure, since the heat has not dissipated, and it's still just as hot at night as it has been, it's not cooling off. I'm sure we're over at least 2,000 Europeans killed by the heat so far. And, you know, this heat wave is scheduled to continue for at least another week. So again, going back to the science thing, that we predicted this. Ecologists, meteorologists, we said this would happen, and now it's happening, and they're kind of dancing around the fact that people are dying by the thousands. Next, this is another story which, this is a pet peeve story, because I have this show and I can air these pet peeves.
Is this about guys at stoplights thinking their gas burning vehicle is faster than yours? Because you talk about that a lot.
No. No, that doesn't bother me, because I'm able to just blow them away with my plug-in hybrid.
Totally.
Yeah, which, by the way, right now I'm at almost 80 miles per gallon this year. I haven't had to get gas for 6 weeks because I've been very aggressive about recharging. So that's kind of nice. No, the pet peeve, the thing that's irritating me, is this fella, his name is George Monbiot, or Monbiot, M-O-N-B-I-O-T, He won something called the Orwellian Prize.
Oh, is that good?
It's supposed to be good, but much like Orwell
Okay,
and Orwellian
right.
things, it's actually bad.
It's double plus ungood.
Right, exactly.
Right,
He's the one who made famous in Animal Farm, or the idea that, you know, governments tend to say like war is peace, and you know, just
That's
the opposite.
1984 stuff.
Oh, 1984, right, I'm sorry. Yeah, 1984, George Orwell. Right, I'm sorry, I mixed those two up. Anyway, he won the Orwellian Prize, which is supposed to be this prize for the best environmental reporting. The problem is that he's an idiot. After Fukushima, he's been an environmental reporter, but after Fukushima, he changed over to being pro-nuclear, which, if you're actually an environmentalist, is like, yeah.
Because Fukushima was so great?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay.
Well, because he was disappointed that people didn't drop like flies. He was saying, oh, well, we were promised, you know, mass deaths on, you know, in the people dying in the streets if there's a nuclear meltdown, and that didn't happen. So
well,
now
it might be kind of more the gift that gives on giving kind of bunch.
Yeah.
You wait a second, you'll get your corpses.
Right. Yeah, he just wasn't patient enough. So, and people are getting cancer at an incredible rate now, 10 years later in Fukushima. People are dying. But this fella, Bayat, interestingly enough, this ties in with another news story that I wanted to do, and that is that unfortunately, despite the fact that the financial director in the government in England said, don't do this, this is a terrible plan, the government, the Conservative government of England, of the UK, has approved a new nuclear plant called Sizewell C. And yeah, it's been a long battle. Many citizens have spoken out against it. There have been protests, and there will continue to be protests. But this fellow Bayat did a big article. He said, well, even though I'm in favor of nuclear power, I don't want Sizewell C. So it's like he has no idea what he's doing, as I said, and he's an idiot, an Orwellian idiot. But yeah, the Sizewell C approval came despite the fact that the financial analysis of the plant shows that it's literally insane to try to build a nuclear plant in England
Wars, peace,
at this
freedom, and
point.
slavery, and nuclear is green energy.
Right.
Clean energy, whatever the hell catchphrase they're using.
Right, so that all ties together. All right, so now, of course, we're coming to the end of the show, and I have to counter all that with some good news.
Finally.
Yes. Australia is up to 1/3 wind and solar power. So it's set a new record in 2021. In 2020, Australia had got 1/4 of its energy from wind and solar, which is impressive. But then just a year later, it's up to 1/3 of its energy from wind and solar. And the reason is, interestingly enough, is small scale solar. Everybody in Australia is putting solar panels on all their roofs as fast as they can. And we've reported on this before. Some of the areas in Australia are up to 40% penetration, like 40% of the buildings have solar on them. And so that added up to 3.3 gigawatts of new solar capacity on the small scale. And then they're also doing a whole bunch on utility scale. They're at 2.9 gigawatts at utility scale. So Australia is doing it. And so all these people that are saying, you know, oh, we can't rely on the wind, we can't rely on the solar, they're intermittent, blah, 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 blah. The problem with those arguments is they're being proven wrong every single day in places like Australia and Germany and all sorts of other places around the world. So if somebody tells you, you know, solar's not practical, just remember they're being proven wrong every day. And that I wanted to revisit a story from last week when I reported on how in the US, for the first time, in the first 4 months in the US, wind and solar power by themselves produced more electricity than nuclear did. And I wanted to revisit this story because I did a Facebook post on this, and I put a link to an article that had a picture of some solar panels on it, and I got like a couple, like a dozen people liked it or shared it or whatever. But then, so redid it, and I redid it as one of those large typeface things with the fancy background, and I reposted just the same information on Facebook, and it's been like well over 100 people have liked and shared it, and that's spreading. And so it's just a reminder that we need repetition. All right, we've been trained through things like commercials. We have to hear something more than once for it to sink in. I think that in political circles they say you need at least 4 repetitions before it really gets into people's consciousness. And so this news that wind and solar outperformed nuclear in the first 4 months of this year needs to be repeated, but it also shows that we've kind of been simplified down, because this little meme thing I did with large type letters and just, you know, half a sentence long, that got lots of likes and repeats, whereas the one where I did it, the whole, here's a link to an article that shows that blah, 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 that just kind of went right past people and they didn't really latch on to it.
Welcome to modern life.
Yeah, it's kind of sad, but that's it for our show. Wow. So I just want to thank everybody for listening and remind you that if you want to comment on the show, and please do, you can go to joe@joedemare4agreenfuture.org. You can also go to our Facebook pages. We have both a page and a group where you can join both or either for A Green Future on Facebook. And of course, you can call or text anytime at 419-973-5841 and leave us a comment. But I just want to thank you folks for listening. This is Joe DeMare.
And Rebecca Wood.
And we are signing off.
I like birds and things, creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done.